Hello again. We are in the fourth week of the course Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. To be precise, we are in the second week of poetry. If you remember, last week we discussed origins of poetry and subtypes of poetry. We made ourselves familiar with poetic manifestations in the early ages across the globe. I am sure you found that class very interesting. So, today's class would be all the more interesting in the sense it is going to give you a kind of an insight into the magic called poetry. How? Because we are going to look at those devices, those elements that power up poetry in extraordinary ways. So, for the sake of our convenience, we can call them elements of poetry. So, during this fourth week, during this particular class, we are going to discuss some various elements of poetry and how these elements give us a kind of a working knowledge of the way poetry works its wonders. All right. So, before we proceed further, I am sure you understand that we have already discussed very many other elements of literature, and some of them may correspond with elements of poetry as well. They might as well overlap here, but nothing to worry. In fact, the more the merrier. It is going to reinforce whatever things we have already learned in some of our previous classes. Before I begin with elements of poetry, you can mentally get prepared for what you think are the elements of poetry. You can just jot down and later you can compare, see how much of these elements you already knew. All right. I am sure during these 4 weeks we have delighted ourselves over several poems from across the globe and from across the periods. So, based on your familiarity with these poems, if you can even jot down a couple of them, that would be really interesting. Okay. Here goes our first element of poetry. Before that, we need to know a little bit about these elements of poetry. What we call figures of speech. Figures of speech are major elements of poetry. They have their parallels in rhetorical devices. In fact, what rhetorical devices do in our everyday communication, figures of speech do that in poetry. All right. In other words, we are discussing the parallels between creative communication and poetry. And when we employ some of these devices in our everyday speech activities, I am sure we would be elevating those communicative elements, those communicative aspects also into the level of poetry. So, we would be elevating our speech acts to the level of poetry if we can implement or infuse some of these poetic devices in our everyday context. Well, to give you a kind of an idea about the vastness of what we are dealing with, we have more than 250 figures of speech in literature. Obviously, we would not be able to cover all of them. What we are going to do here is cover a couple of important figures of speech and see how they add magic to poetry. In other words, we are going to go behind those devices that lend their power and elevate poetry to the level of music or even mantra occasionally. All right. Here comes our first figure of speech. It is called alliteration. Before that, for the sake of convenience, we can subdivide figures of speech into various types. Devices, these can be called sound devices. In other words, figures of speech that deal with the component of sound can be called sound devices. As part of that, alliteration is our first sound device. Well, Alliteration refers to that quality of poetry wherein it lends musical effect to the lines we read. In other words, how does it do it? By repeating an initial consonant sound. So, here this device mimics the musicality of the language or the rhythms that exist in language, and by repeating those sounds it lends a kind of a musical quality to the lines we read with. All right. Its alliteration is one of the earliest used sound device, and when we use alliteration, they enhance our experience of poetry because, as I said, they lend a musical tone to the lines we read. That is how they enhance the impact of poetry. So, it has a certain acoustic value added to the lines that we read. Okay. Even outside poetry, this poetic device is used. As I said, many of these figures of speech correspond with the rhetorical devices. Okay. And when you make use of these devices even in your everyday context, supposing you have got a speech to give, if you can add some of these alliterative elements, I am sure it lends your speech an extraordinary punch, an extraordinary quality. Now, alliteration is generally made use of in tongue twisters as well. That is the reason why tongue twisters are difficult to pronounce. Now, look at this well known tongue twister. She sells seashells by the seashore. Now, look at how there is a kind of a repetition of the sound sh and s at a regular interval. Because of this repetition of these sounds at regular intervals, sometimes it becomes difficult for us to pronounce them, but these are extraordinary ways to even enhance our pronunciation skills also. Okay. Or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Now, look at this, how the sound of p adds a kind of a lilt to language and enhances our listening experience of these lines. And it is also used predominantly in poetry. Well, here is an excerpt from Coleridge's poem. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. The sound f appearing at constant intervals and thereby lending a musical touch to the lines that we read. Alliteration. Well, there are a slight variations of alliteration. I come to that in the next slide. You can call assonance and the next one consonance as part of alliteration in a certain way, but assonance is again a repetition of a sound, but here it is a repetition of a vowel sound. Whatever you have heard in the case of alliteration, here all that holds good as far as the repetition of vowels is concerned. Okay. It is a kind of an alternative to rhyme in verse as well. Look at the examples here. This poem, if you can recall, we have discussed this poem in detail in one of our earlier classes, Dillon Thomas poem, Do not go gentle into good night. Okay. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage against the dying of light. Now, look at the sound, day, a, the vowel sound, rage, age, day, all these things. There is an internal rhyme that follows here, the sound of a, and that comes at certain intervals and thereby creating a kind of a musical impact. So, assonance, like alliteration, is a musical lending device to poetry, music lending device to poetry, you can call it, roughly speaking. Another example is from these immortal lines. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. Stopping by woods, I am sure you will have read this poem. maybe in your during your 10th or 12th or at some other stage, you know. Woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Look at how deep, keep, sleep, there is a repetition of the sound E, right. I am sure now you get a fair understanding of what assonance is. Next we go to consonance. Consonance is again a repetition of sounds, but here consonance, unlike assonance where vowels are repeated at certain intervals, here consonants are repeated at certain intervals here. Generally consonance is confused with alliteration, but what we have to keep in mind here is that alliterations refer specifically to the beginning sound of the word, you know, the first sound of the word, and then how it comes at certain intervals, whereas in consonant it is not so much the beginning, it is towards the end of it, you know. So we have plenty of examples here, say for instance, shall I part my hair behind, do I dare to eat a peach, and then beach, each, all these things. And in other example we have moaning, waving, drowning. Look at how at certain intervals, especially towards the end, okay, especially towards the end of the word, it's, you can call it an end rhyming one. Consonance is where towards the end of the word that you know, consonant repeats and thereby lends musical quality. It's consonance. After consonance we move on to onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is an extraordinary sound device. Here the sounds that we make use of are so powerful and so evocative that they can reconstruct the meaning. In other words, the sounds are so extraordinary and so evocative that they can mimic what we describe or what the words try to describe here. Okay. Generally speaking, these words are they test the limit of a language. In fact, a poem that makes extensive use of onomatopoeic words are difficult to translate because, well, these sounds are peculiar to the language in which they are used. Therefore, when you translate, you know, words with similar meaning, they may not have the same sound dimension in the target language, right. So, these words that lend the quality of music to poetry are unique to that particular language, right. Therefore, while translating them, it becomes a kind of a nightmare for a translator to bring out the effect that the poet has brought out in the source poem. So, they are unique to the language in which they are used. Say words like for instance such as you know, splash, gush, hiss, drizzle, drip. So, these are some words that are capable of evoking the meaning of them. So, for instance, you can say the book fell on the table with a loud thump, you know. So, the sound thump clearly evokes the magnitude with which the books fell on the table, you know, something like that. Or it can even be used, for instance, as Hemingway uses, you know, he heard the clack on stone and the leaping, dropping clicks of a small rock falling. Look how beautifully the language mimics the action, you know, the sound mimics the action here. There was a rustling that seemed like a bustling, buzzing, you know. So, movement of leaves and small sounds, how beautifully they evoke the image. Onomatopoeia is an extraordinary sound device. All right. So, there is another minor sound device called anaphora. So, anaphora is a figure of speech that concerns itself with a repetition of a particular word or phrase, you know. So, at regular intervals you keep you know, you keep visiting this string of words or phrases, so that when they come together like that, when they come together at such kind of regular intervals, they create a kind of an emphasis. In other words, you can say that anaphora is a literary device or a poetic device that is used in order to emphasize a point, in order to draw attention towards a particular segment. You make use of it. It is a highly stylized approach as far as the repetition of a word is concerned, especially at the beginning of each phrase, and when you use it, it creates an extraordinary impact even in your regular speeches. If you have listened to an extraordinary leader speaking, in order to emphasize what he or she speaks, these leaders make use of anaphora. Now look at this: great haste makes great waste. A small phrase, almost anagrammatic. Here it makes use of let us say how many words here? 5 words. In 5 words a word is repeated, great, and thereby it draws our attention to the quantity here. Great haste makes great waste. So our attention is drawn towards the quantity, for instance. And again the second example as well: so many books, so little time. So many books, so little time. This can be an example for another important literary device. We are going to discuss that in a very short while, but look at this, the word so here. So again the quantity. Now if you want the moon, do not hide from the night. If you want a rose, do not run from the thorns. If you want love, do not hide from yourself. Look at the string of words here: if you want, if you want, if you want. Almost how if you want something, you need to do this. If you want something, you need to do this. If you recall some extraordinary lines of George Bush, he says, especially during the times of crisis, if you say, if you are Americans, you are with us. If you are Americans, you do not support this. If you are Americans, you do not borrow to this ideology, something like this. This is how you make use of this device. Okay. Here the sound is of course here again a sound. Maybe you can use either a word here or even a string of words in order to create that sound impact. More than that, here the sound impact is used in order to emphasize on a particular aspect. So it is anaphora. All right. From the sound devices, let us move on to figures of speech that concern themselves with relationships and resemblances. So we are moving on to a different segment of figures of speech, and as I said, these are also rhetorical devices. There is a lot of overlapping between them. Rhetorical devices are those devices that are used to create an impact during your everyday conversation, especially during speeches, and figures of speeches are those devices that are used especially in poetry. Therefore, you can find overlaps depending on your usage. You call them a rhetorical device or a figure of speech. Simile is one of the most commonly used figures of speech that we come across in literature, be it a good piece of prose or verse. We come across similes. Here simile is used in order to liken one object or one thing to another. You are comparing. So, in other words, this figure of speech is used for comparison. We also have other figures of speeches that are used in the context of comparison, but they are slightly different. Here comparison, in the sense it is a straightaway comparison. It is a straightaway comparison. How do you know it is a straightaway comparison? Look out for words such as like and as, like and as. For example, you can say you are as bright as sun, you look as bright as the sun. So, you are comparing the brightness of the person with the brightness of the sun, and it is a direct comparison because as we make use of the word as. So, it is a common example for simile. Therefore, you can say that simile is a literary device. It is a literary device that makes use of words such as like and as, and here the linguistic constructions are employed to establish equivalence. They are used to establish equivalence and demonstrate likeness, commonality, commonality. So, some of the common examples would include spring is like perhaps hand which comes carefully out of nowhere arranging a window into which people look. Brilliant line by E. Cummings, spring is likened to something here. And another example from prose is parents are like God. Here parents are compared to God in a particular aspect. What is that aspect is given in the next part of the sentence. Parents are like God because you want to know they are out there and you want them to think well of you, but you really only call when you need something. So, this is how simile works, by establishing a kind of a linguistic equivalence between one thing and the other. You compare them, you liken them, you equate them. Here the equation between two things is achieved by employing words such as and like. As opposed to simile, we have metaphor, okay? And metaphor is one of the rich figures of speech employed in literature and especially in poetry as well, okay? Even in metaphor there is a comparison, but this comparison is more subtle, or you can say it is a little more sophisticated and nuanced, in the sense it is not a direct comparison. Like simile, it is not a direct comparison, therefore, you do not find words such as and like. Instead, two dissimilar things are compared in a very subtle and an elegant way, Therefore, you can say that say for instance, no man is an island. When you say no man is an island, what are you comparing? You are comparing man with island. Well, they are not a set of words that correlate with each other unless you bring out the connection in later part of the sentence, right. Therefore, in that sense they are not similar, man and an island. So, you need to qualify that by adding something more, No man is an island is an extraordinary line by John Donne. So, here that is how we say that two dissimilar objects are compared. Now, how look at this here in these remarkable lines. We find the metaphor of fire and ice and how the poet builds these metaphor using these lines. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I have tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice, right. So, these are some important poetic devices that we can keep in mind. Personification, we can go ahead and discuss one or two more figures of speech in this class. Personification is another important figure of speech. Here too there is a comparison, there is also a comparison, but in a different way. Here, as as this device, personification, as the term suggests, you attribute the qualities of a person to a non-person. In other words, you humanize even those objects which are not human, right? You attribute the qualities of human beings to non-human things, objects, or you can say animals, flowers, or anything, Thereby, it is a way of looking at the world in the image of ourselves, right? These are the ways through which we consider, everything around us in our own likeness. In other words, this is a brilliant figure of speech that can foster oneness with everything that we see around, because we humanize even a chair, we humanize nature, we humanize bird, we attribute the qualities of human being, right. So, look at the examples that we have here. This is an extraordinary excerpt from a well known poem by Emily Dickinson, okay, because I could not stop for death. How even death, which is as merciless, it is not exactly merciless, but we consider that as merciless because it takes away those that are closest to us. So, how Emily Dickinson makes death her friend. She attributes the qualities of a fellow human being to death and calls death her friend. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Look at this interesting choice of the pronoun here, he for death. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality, in carriage. Well, probably immortality is also humanized here. Well, it has the poet or the poetic person, and then death and immortality, how all these things are humanized, right. So, this is, as I said, an extraordinary literary device wherein we look at the world in our image, So, probably this is where you are reminded of, yad bhavam tad bhavati. As I imagine it, so does it become. As I imagine it, so does it become. It is a way of achieving oneness with the world around. And we have apostrophe. Apostrophe is again a figure of speech, may not be used as extensively as a metaphor or a personification. Nevertheless, it is an important figure of speech. Here what happens, the poet directly addresses a non-human being as if it can understand his or her feelings and emotions. So, it is not personification here, but there is an implied understanding of personification, because here, or you can say that it is a specialized personification addressed only in the context of speaking. So, we have a very well known poem. If you can recall, we also discussed this poem in one of our earlier classes, Ode to West Wind, right. O wild west wind, he addresses west wind as if he were addressing his friend. The poet addresses nightingale as if he were addressing his friend. To a cuckoo, ode to a nightingale. So, generally in odes, especially odes that were written during the Romantic period, they make use of this particular literary device. There is, you directly address them. Well, when you say you address them, they may not be alive, they may be dead, they may be even inanimate or abstract concepts. Nevertheless, you address them, okay. And as a literary device, apostrophe also allows the poetic person to express his or her feelings in a free manner. it's like bearing oneself out thoroughly. So, when you address a nightingale as a friend, then you can say whatever you wish to say about that nightingale. When you start interacting with the west wind, then you can start you can begin opening yourself up to the west wind. So, thereby it is also used as a kind of a device wherein you can express your internal thoughts and sentiments. Even when they do not respond, you assume they respond to you and go on addressing them, something like this. So, I am sure this class has given you an idea about the rhetorical devices and how the same rhetorical devices act as literary devices when they are used in poetry or novels, and how they give you a kind of an insight into a kind of how poetry gets its charge, how they charge up poetry through their uniqueness and things like that. I am sure in the next class we are going to discuss some more of them. Until then you can revise some of these devices. Probably what you can do in order to perfect your understanding of these devices, why don't you construct a short story? Imagine you are about to narrate the story to a friend of yours, or why don't you use these devices and give a kind of a short speech and see how they lend an extraordinary power. They act as an impetus, and enliven, they electrify the way you give speeches. See and experience it for yourself by employing them in a speech. All right. Until then, until we see you in the next class, bye bye, take care.